So I thought, Frank, today we'd talk about islands because islands have been coming into the news a lot, and especially in the South China Sea. And mostly they're islands that I think nobody's ever heard of before, or most of the people who are reading the news haven't heard of. And occasionally the people reporting on them are kind enough to put a map there to give us an idea of where they are, but since nobody studies geography anymore, I'm not sure even whether people can read maps usefully. But these islands in the South China Sea are particularly interesting because we know them by non-Chinese names, and it's the Chinese who are claiming them, and that in itself makes me anyway wonder about the significance of these islands historically. And as I thought about it more, it came to me that islands like this weren't really inhabited until very late. So I think most of the populations of small islands out in the middle of large expanses of water, that is, not islands like Japan and England, but islands like Fiji and the Spratlys and Réunion and the Seychelles and Mauritius and Diego Garcia, for example. Even the more significant ones didn't really get inhabited until 5,000 years ago, when a new attitude towards ocean travel seemed to develop. Mm-hmm. And then it was only really in the age of discovery, starting in the 16th century, that large navies began to take an interest in islands, and they also began to move people around from one island to another. And so we had one age of islands from about 5,000 years ago to about 500 years ago. And since then, another age of islands has begun, in which islands really are interesting only because of their usefulness to international navigation.
Well, I would respectfully submit that at least if this conversation was being joined by people in Beijing in the leadership, they would say it much more so than just for international navigation, but also for power projection. The Chinese, of course, think of those island tiers as the first tier of islands, the second tier of islands, and the third tier of islands, moving from west out to east. And that whole area, even in that first tier in the South China Sea, has, since the end of World War II, been the domain of the United States Navy, which is why China's actions now regarding the Spratlys is causing some international concern.
Well, I was going to say, first it was the development of new types of boats that could be used by people with not very highly developed technologies to navigate large expanses of ocean. Mm-hmm. And then it was a much more highly developed sailing technology starting about 500 years ago, which continued to develop. And then it was the international traffic on oceans that determined the use of islands. And now that has only just recently begun to change with the interest in natural resources under the sea, right, and countries claiming that their boundaries extend way out into the oceans, at least 200 miles, if not more. And if they can claim an island, that gives them an extra 200 miles, probably. So that the significance of the Falkland Islands now is different even than it was in 1980. Mm-hmm. However, then I think that in fact we're about to enter into yet another stage in the history of islands when the significance of islands will become different again, because if we're moving into new sources of energy which seems to be happening not only because of the problems with international oil supply and demand, but also nuclear energy supply and demand, and the increased interest in wind energy and solar energy that has come into the news in the last few weeks. That's going to once again change people's interest in islands. So, I mean, this I find particularly interesting because I used to study oases in deserts, and when the only means of travel was by camel, oases were very important. Mm-hmm. But when motorized traffic came in 50 years ago, nobody bothered about oases anymore because they could drive around the outside of deserts much more comfortably than they could travel across the middle of deserts. Mm-hmm. And now I think the same sort of thing is happening to oceans and the value of islands within oceans.
Well, I think based on the analysis that you just rendered, the bypassing of the islands because of mechanization is something that has occurred, and then now as a result of the resource push and much of the energy push, perhaps they're becoming popular again, to put it crudely. It's very interesting that we're having this discussion about islands. Because in a newspaper column in Argentina just today, the president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, accused British Prime Minister David Cameron of mediocrity bordering on stupidity about his comments concerning the Falkland Islands, when he noted that the Falkland Islands will remain British until the population decides otherwise. And she went on to say that the Royal Navy are pirates, and that Britain continues to be a crude colonial power in decline because colonialism is out of date as well as unjust. She went on and on and on. Of course, she's preparing herself to run for re-election, and there's nothing better than bashing the British lion, and especially in Argentina, where just this week, 29 years ago, they endured the occasion of the surrender of the official ending of hostilities with Margaret Thatcher's government in that war. So
this is interesting. I saw that announcement, the news about her talk, and I found it particularly interesting not only because I agree with David Cameron, but I also to some extent agree with her. Because you know what the British did with the population of Diego Garcia, I think just about 40 years ago, when the American Navy wanted a base in the Indian Ocean. Mm-hmm. They found it useful to move the population from Diego Garcia in order to turn that group of islands over to the American Navy, mm-hmm. to make it a major naval base in the Indian Ocean.
Right, it's a big stopping off point for B-52s right now.
Yeah. So it's when it's useful, you can say that the people who live in the islands should make up their own minds about what country they want to belong to. But mm-hmm. when it's not useful, you can argue the other way, that the strategic importance of the islands might be more important. So it's unfortunate that David Cameron, if the president of Argentina were to knew about the case of Diego Garcia, she could make a much better case.
That's true. She could have bolstered her argument. In this era of increased globalization, increased velocity of encounters between people, how much of that is impacting the island cultural view of themselves as either a part or integrated with the global community as a whole, would you think?
Well, I was talking to somebody who lives on Mauritius earlier this week, which was what got me starting to think about.
Let's put that in context. All right, I believe that's a island off the west coast of Africa, some distance.
It's sort of south of India and east of the east coast of Africa. And it's particularly interesting because it was first a French colony, mm-hmm. and then the British managed to get it away from the French at the beginning of the 19th century, and it remained a French-speaking English colony.
A French-speaking English colony, all right?
Yes, and it has remained quite reasonably economically prosperous, I think. But obviously it's much better connected to everything else that's going on in the world now than it was before. However, it's my sense that as it gets better and better connected, fewer and fewer people will want to live there, except to provide a resort to people from the larger continents who want to get away from it all for a short time. I can see the integrity and unity of these small island communities decreasing, and becoming more and more projections for holiday activities from the larger.
Did your friend have any interesting anecdotes,
First-person anecdotes that would lend to?
No, he's in business, and he's exploiting the import-export opportunities in a place like Mauritius, which are changing as the economy changes, as it becomes more directly connected to what's going on in the not just in the countries surrounding the Indian Ocean, which is of course the way it has been, but much further afield. It seems to me that all these groups of islands, whether it's the Comoros and those other islands off the east coast of Africa and Zanzibar, or the South China Sea, or the islands off the east coast of China, they're all, their geopolitical situation is changing.
But the change, doesn't it increasingly then, isn't it amplified as well by their large mainland neighbors who begin to covet them? So to the
Japan and China are fighting over a group of islands south of Japan and east of China, and these islands in the South China Sea are now being fought over between China and, well, not argued over, between China and Vietnam. And I think that even the Philippines has some interest in them.
Right.
And then nobody's quite sure what to do about some of the other islands in the Indian Ocean.
Historically, would there be any kind of analogy that could be made from some of the ancient classical Greek period islands that were minor potentates at the time, insofar as power projection coming from an island? Where's your cutoff point? Obviously, England is an island, all right, but it's a very big island. Okinawa is a smaller island. Do you have a Sicily, for example, is an island that at one point long ago, usually always associated with a Greek power base, was able to exercise some suzerainty over an area of Italy. Is there an analogy historically that comes to mind that gives evidence to projection of power from an island?
I think that all these islands in the past were important to the extent that they were connected in some way to the mainland, so that Sicily was part of the kingdom of southern Italy. The King of England considered himself the King of France from the later Middle Ages until 1760, I think.
Yes.
So they weren't separate. It's only very recently that we've come to think of the coasts as natural boundaries. To the extent that there was easy sea connection by sea to somewhere, the sea wasn't considered to be a boundary.
So it's globalization now. I mean, I have a lot of first-hand experience with people in Bermuda. I go there on business frequently. It's an hour and 35 minutes away by plane from Philadelphia. You go there, you run into Anglo-Saxon Bermudans who are 5th, 6th generation Bermudans. And they are as versed in American politics, American baseball, American football as am I. So I begin to wonder, really, is the remoteness any longer a factor?
I think that the remoteness becomes important only for leisure activities.
Interesting.
And not for actually independent community organization anymore. I think we've come to the end of our time for today. So
we have, unfortunately. It's very interesting. Well, thank you. We'll reconvene again shortly.